Necesita interpretación al español. Por favor, se sienten. ¿Dónde? Cerca de la señora con el vestido verde. Welcome, everybody. We are a group that is from the Arizona Palestine Solidarity Alliance, and we're going to be doing a presentation on an upcoming report, and you'll hear more about that in a moment, but just want to welcome you and mention that there's a sign-in sheet for getting more information from our email list. You don't get a lot of emails, and then we have some posters and kofiyas and t-shirts. But we want to start out this program by taking a moment to together remember that we are here. The land we are on is unceded Tohono O'odham land. So let's just take a moment to remember that together. Thank you. I'm Sarah Roberts, by the way, and I'm going to pass the mic to Muhyiddin Abdulaziz.
Thank you. Welcome. First, thank you to the SOAW Watch for giving us this opportunity to present to you this workshop on border militarization here in our borderlands as well as in Palestine. You will find out that there is a lot of similarities between what's happening here and what's happening in occupied Palestine. We have been working for almost a couple of years now on developing this report. We'll come to that later, but before we do that, I want to give you some introduction to our organization, which is called Arizona Palestine Solidarity Alliance. The Palestinian people in 2005 initiated a campaign of boycott, divestment, and sanctions against the state of Israel until Israel complies with international law. This campaign was an alternative, a civil society alternative to the struggle against the occupation. It is a non-violent resistance to the occupation. Soon, this movement became an international movement of which we are part. Okay? The international BDS movement is not a structured movement. That is, we as a chapter in Tucson and also now in Phoenix, don't report to a hierarchy or somebody. We are in the spirit of the BDS movement, but we are also independent and we do our work locally. So we are part of this BDS movement. We are a solidarity anti-militarization group. We are trying to develop a regional movement opposing the ongoing US-Israeli partnership that supports the brutal occupation of the Palestinian people and lands and the increasing militarization of the US-Mexico border region. We are a coalition of groups and individuals working together as a part of a global movement for a campaign of boycott, divestment, and sanctions against Israel until it complies with international law, respects Palestinian fundamental rights of freedom, equality, and self-determination, and ends its occupation and colonization of Arab lands. In addition, we strongly oppose the militarization of the US border and support border justice and indigenous rights and power. As a coalition of groups and individuals working together, we are part of the global movement for a boycott, divestment, and sanctions. Or did I do this already? Yeah. Okay.
It bears repeating.
Okay.
Yes, it
So
does.
that's in a nutshell, okay, what our organization focuses on. We are part of the BDS, International BDS Solidarity Movement, as well as we're working on the local issues here, specifically the militarization of the border and the role that the Israeli government plays in this militarization. We would like you to join us, every one of you, hopefully. And if you are not on our mailing list, please sign up. We have a mailing list here. It gives you an opportunity as a US citizen or not citizen to be part of this movement here, and it gives you an opportunity to be part of the struggle. So I hope you will do that. So what is the report that we are working on, that this workshop is about? It's a report on militarization from the borderlands to Palestine. We research and document the effect of militarization on land, the environment, and all living things. That's what is, that's the core of this research project. It is about settler colonialism in the borderlands and in Palestine, and you probably, you will hear, maybe not for the first time, but something you don't hear often is that this here is occupied land. It's settler colonialism, just like what is happening in Palestine right now. Okay, we will once we have this. We were hoping to have this report ready for publication at this time, but unfortunately we're not there yet. But it will be coming very soon, and it will have two versions. There will be a printed version, like in a booklet format, okay, as well as in an electronic version, okay, that will include infographics, videos, and multimedia stuff, okay. So that is about the report. As I said, we have been working on this report for about 2 years now, and to do that, we received 2 grants that helped us to send 2 people to Palestine, and we had also Blake and his team of researchers went to Honotam in Mexico to do the research. Peace Development Fund gave us a grant, as well as the Spark Plug Foundation. So we thank him very much for helping us in this project. Our team is comprised of the following, and most of them are here. Blake Gentry here, and Gabe next to him, and Jeff Boyce sitting there, and Rebecca Cartal is not here. She is the coordinator of this project, and she's going to school in Canada, so she's doing that remotely. And Sarah Roberts standing there, and Tasneem Zahlan is our new coordinator. Where is Tasneem? Is there. And Todd Miller, who was not able to join us because he has a new baby. There he is. Okay, now I want to give the microphone to Gabe, which will talk to us about Elbit Towers and the role of Israel in the militarization of the borders here.
We can sit air.
Yes.
Does anybody else have?
Yes.
Yes, air would be good.
And the fans?
Kind of window? It's a little loud.
No, I've been in this room with the fans on and it's okay.
Okay, let's see if we can figure out how to turn the fans on.
As long as you're not too high.
Anybody know?
There you go. Bingo. Somebody pull the chain on that fan right there, in the middle.
We can make it go faster, maybe. Right there?
There's another light switch right there. There we go. Thank you. Those who are just coming in, please take your seats. We need to get started because we have very little time and a lot of material.
Okay, everybody is feeling okay with the weather in here?
Improved.
As Mohadeen said, I'm Gabe, one of the researchers, and I just wanted to point out, it might be a little fuzzy. Here is a side-by-side photo of the Elbit Towers. Elbit is Israel's largest private security firm, arms manufacturer, and side-by-side showing towers that made them famous on the annexation wall in the West Bank. And a few minutes from here, this is a photo of this, one of the Elbit Towers that I thought I would tell a brief story to illustrate this section of the report that Todd Miller and I wrote. And it starts with when we first found out about the tower's construction. Todd and I wrote an investigative essay that came out in January 2015, starting on a series of investigations. This one detailing the emergence of a oh, sure. One second.
Just want to double check if anyone needs interpretation into Spanish. Si alguien quiere interpretación al español, que se levante la mano, que ya llegaron otros. Okay. Thank you.
No, it's okay. So we detailed a triangular emerging boundary building complex here in southern Arizona between state corporate institutions involving the United States, out of the Arizona tech parks here, Mexico, and Israel. And we had been bothering Customs and Border Protection to tell us that their integrated fixed tower project that they awarded just months earlier, $145 million at the time, contract to Elbit Systems of America, which is the subsidiary of the Elbit Systems parent company based in Israel, to tell us that they indeed started constructing the towers. And of course, they were pretty tight-lipped about it. We couldn't get confirmation, and we had to go to print anyway, so ran the article, and literally a couple days later, a friend of ours, an aid worker who knows the hills and valleys and canyons surrounding Nogales very, very well, and was hiking and literally saw something that he didn't see the day before, and it looked very much like what we were describing in the article as one of the possible towers. So he calls us up, and we assemble ourselves, and we want to go right out there and see if this is indeed one of the towers, and it would mean they have finally launched the project, which is earmarked as a pilot project to expand this virtual wall system, which is essentially a revamped project of a tower project called SBI-Net, started under the George W. Bush administration and then later scrapped under the Obama administration. So we went out there, and there were a couple of international journalists who were in town already, and so the four of us, we started making our way out there. This one was off of Ruby Road, which some of you may or may not have seen. It's a few minutes outside of town, the back road. And on the way there, it's related to note that the tower, as it indeed popped up on the horizon as we were going down Ruby Road, is built on Coronado National Forest, which is related to the national security waivers. They don't even need waivers to build these towers and Border Patrol access roads and whatnot, but that refers to, again, under the George W. Bush administration, expanded under Obama, and now a little bit more under Trump, waiving dozens of environmental regulations left and right, historical, many of them settler, landmarks, nature preserves, public lands, private ranches, private lands along the borderline to build the wall expansion under Bush Secure Fence Act of 2006, of which Elbit was a subcontractor that was awarded to Boeing. So as we're hiking up the hill, and there's this tower in the distance. It's probably one of the Elbit towers, but we have to confirm. The tower project fits into a combination of tactical units, surveillance technology, and boundary infrastructure, all part of a multi-layered strategy of deterrence, prevention through deterrence, out of a 1994 Border Patrol strategy that has been expanded into new iterations, which may become relevant during Q&A, called Consequence Delivery System. But the strategy into which these towers fit, or to harness quoting the Border Patrol planning document at the time, the mortal danger, the hazardous remoteness of the desert borderlands by intensifying forward enforcement in the areas away from traditional crossing points of urban areas. Something that, in their own words, the leaders designed to maximize death, essentially, and you weaponize the desert to do that. Even in their own words, quoting the chief sadist in residence of the Clinton administration at the time, Doris Meissner, who was one of the policy planners. Yes, we did use the ally, and we did look at geography as an ally to, as one Border Patrol agent put it, construct choke points, quote unquote, in the desert. And since then, at least 7,000 human remains have been recovered since the 1990s when these military operations started. So as we're going up the hill, and I look to my left and I see over this vast, beautiful valley right outside town here, this little speck on another hilltop, which is where they put the towers on the hilltops. Border Patrol loiter on hilltops. This is age-old military tactic of hilltop deployment. You see this speck of a Border Patrol truck just loitering there. That's most of their job, they just loiter. And then I look back to my right as we're coming up to the tower, and sure enough, it is being constructed. And there's a bunch of construction workers, and they're in their orange neon vests, and there is a armed security guard there. Now, of course, they see these civilians coming up, and we're not supposed to be there, so they immediately confront us. Not violently, but they want to know who we are and what we're doing there. And I wanted to pause there really quick to give some background on the Israeli Homeland Security industry and the apparatus itself, because I know that any of us who are, no matter how familiar with Israel and Israeli aggression and the war machine and all these other words that we know are true about how Israel has this dizzyingly, stunningly effective apparatus. But what are the actual numbers? Like, what does the texture of that look like? We look at if you put the United States and its military might next to Israel, and you look at their numbers, specifically per capita, because in other ways, Israel doesn't measure up. The United States has far more resources, far more finances, far more military power, military bases everywhere. The sun doesn't even seem to set on U.S. empire all over the world. But per capita, per unit, per person kind of analysis, you see what the performance of Israel is in this 8,000 square mile area of historic Palestine that they're controlling. The size of New Jersey. So with the size of New Jersey, Israel has per capita the largest homeland security industry in the world per capita, far outnumbering all of the other arms exporters in the world. I mean, I compare Israel to the U.S. here, but when I do that, just keep in mind that the other major arms exporters, the other colonist nations, France, Germany, Britain, Russia, China, and a few places, Israel and the United States, Israel has double, when you look at the percentage of the national workforce that are employed in the arms industry, in the arms sector in the United States, and you look at the percentage of the national workforce that are Israeli, it's double. Israel employs double the amount of the percentage of the workforce here in the United States in the arms industry. And in terms of arms exports per capita, Israel is twice the size of the United States performance of arms exports. And when it comes to per GDP accruements from arms exports, Israel's 500% higher than the United States. It just outpaces it everywhere. So what Todd and I, as the two researchers that Mohadin said were sent to Palestine to look at the other corner of this complex here in southern Arizona, we wanted to know, how do they do this? I mean, we have an idea, we all know the propaganda, and not to knock propaganda, I think it's very valuable for our struggle. But we want to put some actual numbers here. We want to learn and see the shape and the landscape, the texture of how they actually do this. And so we track down the boundary builders themselves. We go to a drone conference on our first day there, and we meet this charismatic CEO of essentially the counterpart of the Tech Parks Arizona here, which is seen as a business incubator where they host as tenants small, medium, and large homeland security companies, and just sort of shoot them full of resources and direction, and give them the facilities, and just let them loose to perfect their products and try them out in a laboratory here in the U.S.-Mexico Borderlands. And that's their wording. They have laboratories built on the Tech Park campus not far from here. So the Israeli counterpart to that is called IHLS, is Israeli. It's one of them. There's many of them. And this is one of the first questions we ask Guy Karen is his name. we ask him how is Israel able to do this, and he tells us frankly that it's because we are checking our systems live. He says we, like you or other nations around the world, don't have to build these weapons and then wait to try them out. We're trying them out and perfecting them again in real time. This is what he tells us. And I think to myself, when we're in that interview in the sweltering heat, which turned out to be the hottest year in record, and Israel, like the United States, some of you have read Todd Miller's book, harnessing and preparing the convergence of controlling climate refugees and the effects of climate change. He wasn't the first one to think of, and he's talking about Gaza, of course, and he's not the first one to look at Gaza as a laboratory. And everybody from a brigadier general who visited El Paso and was a keynote speaker, he talked about how, quoting him, "We've learned lots from Gaza. It's a great laboratory," he tells to the audience of Border Patrol officials and technocrats and corporate officials. And a fellow scholar who was doing the same kinds of research as we were, named Leila Stockmar, a Danish scholar, she went and to all of these conferences and spoke to many representatives just like we did. And quoting her, what they told her: once an order has been made by the Israeli military and after initial deployment in the field, the company's technical departments are often contacted with demands for corrections and tweaks based on experience. Thus, every time the military uses Israeli Homeland Security technology, it automatically tests it. Companies benefit greatly from this, and every time a new order is placed, this feedback from the battlefield is injected to improve the process of tendering and guarantee quality and effectiveness, quoting her. And just a few months ago, in April 2018, Saar Korsh, then the CEO of Magal Systems, was one of the companies vying for Trump's contract to build more border walls, reported as having described Gaza as a quote-unquote showroom for the company's smart fences, whose customers, quote, appreciate that products are battle tested. And plenty of customers, global customers, are sold on the idea. You just look at the profit margins that reflect it. Magal's US traded shares jumped in late 2016 as Trump talked about a Mexican border wall, according to Bloomberg Business. And during the first month of Israel's largest attack yet on Gaza in 2014, the share price of Elbit Systems increased 6.1% in the first month in which 2,200 Palestinians were killed. And so that's how Elbit's major selling point, 10 plus years in securing the world's most challenging border, to quote their brochures and their selling points, that's what this means. They're selling a model all over the world. From Western Europe to Latin America, their global subsidiaries are active. In fact, one of the Elbit's leaders at that conference made a presentation in which he said, "The world has changed," he declared in the audience that we were sitting. "The challenge," he said, "is much wider. Homeland security takes a much bigger place. Today the world is much more gray, and the shades are multiplying." And so Elbit's famed Torch, they call it all caps Torch electronic surveillance system, is heavily touted in the West Bank especially, is now deployed in southern Arizona. They're built about roughly half of the 52 towers slated under the project. And discuss more in the Q&A, but I'll leave it there, including 14 that are slated for the Ana Atam Nation.
Thank you, Kate.
It's a lot of work that Todd and Kate did and other scholars, so we really appreciate that. My name is Blake. As Mohideen said, I've been working for 20 plus years with the Autumn in Mexico. I started as an employee of the Autumn Nation, worked with this committee for a couple of years now, and I spent a month in Israel and Palestine occupied territory, West Bank and Jordan. And during that time, I was the witness to 10 days of bombing in Operation Cast Lead. And because of that bombing, I decided to work trying to understand how this model of militarization and settler colonialism applies both to the people that I've been working with here for a long time, the Altum, but also to Palestine, and understand this through various means. One of those is what Gabe has eloquently described, and that is the industry and how militarization seems to appear as a force that can't be reckoned with. Partly what I'm going to do today is go over some history, but not all history. Some of you will know some of this, so please bear with me. It is an attempt to do a comparative analysis of two places. They have some things in similar. They're both arid regions. They both have indigenous peoples. Those are the Palestinians and the Autumn. And there's other things that are similar. And what I'm going to try to do is decloak the aspect of militarization that we see before us, try to deconstruct it, and show it as part of a larger picture, which is settler colonialism. And part of the challenge to do this is practical, because as activists, we also need to know how to deal with this monster. And if we are only overwhelmed by the technology as if we cannot overcome it because we're mere human beings, then we need to step back and understand what colonization is like, how it was constructed, and then also how it can be deconstructed. So I'm going to move forward fairly quickly. One of the premier authors of settler colonialism is Patrick Wolf. He's not the only one, but he has described settler colonialism as a series of iterative processes. 7 of those, I whittled it down to 5, and I've renamed them, and they're the following. One is the ideology of settler colonialism. The other one is indigenous displacement. The third one is indigenous dispossession. The fourth one is settler colonist resource extraction. And the fifth one is border militarization. So we're going to go backwards, and then we're going to come back again to border militarization. To present this analysis, I had to do some hard thinking, because in 1982 I was part of a delegation that came to Tucson, Arizona as part of the sanctuary movement, and we had a proposal for the first national sanctuary meeting, and that was to denounce border militarization in a place called Texas. None of the people who were from Tucson supported that proposal, but the Salvadorans and the Guatemalans present in the room did, because they came from a place that was undergoing severe repression. And we also... Yeah, the 5 are ideology of settler colonialism. The second is indigenous displacement. The third one is indigenous dispossession. The fourth one is settler colonist resource extraction. The fifth one, is border militarization. So that resolution that we proposed and was passed was a sign that just because you live on a border doesn't mean you understand border militarization. The reason that it touched us in Texas is because we knew people were being shipped back to Guatemala or El Salvador, put in Ilopango prison outside of San Salvador, being tortured and killed and murdered. Other people were being sent back to war zone, where they were being killed by bombing by the United States supplied bombs during that war. So border militarization can be a very big and large process that covers lots of geography. But not everything that happens is border militarization. Israel, as well as the United States and Mexico, is still engaged in settler colonialism. This particular presentation is going to focus on water regimes, the use of water regimes as a tool for colonization by settlers and states. The reason is because we both have this challenge in arid lands, is to conserve water and use water. And without water, none of the things that El Beat or any other Israeli development project tries to carry out or negate for the Palestinians can happen without water. It attempts to look at settler colonialism as an identifiable phase that precedes border militarization and precedes the legal instrumentation of militarization. It looks at violent displacements and dispossession of lands sanctioned by settler colonialists, and it tries to identify, at the very end, indigenous resistance, both Palestinian and Autumn. So I know that most folks are familiar with the history of Zionism. This is not a small seminar on that, but I do want to mention a few things, because I think oftentimes the beginning point for many people in the United States is post-1947, and I think the more important part is pre-1947. There were two movements of immigrants who came in, Jewish immigrants, and they constituted two different migrations. One was the old Yeshiva movement, which was supported by Rothschild until 1900, in which he cut off the funds for those mostly urban 4 or 5 small settlements, which were not particularly aggressive in terms of being Zionists. The second wave, though, came in with the political Zionists, the formation of which long preceded Herschel. As Kumitze has written, other writers were Hess, who was around from 1812 to 1875, Pinsker from 1821 to 1891, Lillenblum, and Birban. They were all Zionist intellectuals who formed their thoughts before 1862. And then it was with World War II, where Heschel and others, and the Zionist leader from Russia, Ushishkin, who pushed for the new Yeshiv movement. And that new Yeshiv movement was then the creation of what is known as the kibbutzim. The first form of those settlers, so those are the first two. The third one then is in the West Bank. So there's 3 waves of settler colonists in Israel, and it's important, or coming out of Israel in Palestine, occupied Palestine, and it's important to understand the first 2 if you want to understand the third one. So one of the things that is overlooked oftentimes, because now we have what is called the IDF and their capacity to facilitate an industry which Gabe and Todd have researched and which we know is a formidable foe, the 6th largest exporter of arms in the world. And that is that kibbutzim started out with rural guards. These were defensive guards in the beginning, but those defensive guards, the Haganah and the Irgun split off of the Haganah, and what was an offensive guard became, a defensive guard became an offensive guard. Those offensive guards then became what we call militias or paramilitary. Eventually, the Haganah formed an offensive strike force called the Palmach, which was a second militia. And then with the addition of those Jewish fighters that came from World War II, with the conflict in World War II, they brought in people who were more like professional soldiers, and they moved from the Haganah, or from the Palmach, into the IDF in 1947 before the partition, okay? But those paramilitaries are really important to understand because those were from settler colonists. Israel did not exist, and neither did the IDF. We'll return back to militias when we talk more about the Yatam, but we're going to move forward now to looking at the effects of what happens in the use of water regimes. And how do I forward these slides? This here. And can we make it bigger?
There are a few seats if folks want to fill in the seats. Seats in the middle. People want to move in.
We got off somewhere. I'm looking for the Palestinian. There we go. They're not in there. All right, I'll have to do this orally. The slides are not in the slideshow. So there are 3 places I was going to talk about. I'll have to do this from memory. One is Al-Aqaba, which is in the Tabbuz Governorate, and it's in northern, it edges into Area C, which is the northern Jordan area. And Al-Aqaba, since the 60s and early 70s, was a place where Israel has systematically eliminated the water source for the people who live there. At one point in the last 10 or 15 years, the people of Al-Aqaba decided to try to tap into the water that was being taken from the aquifer that existed under their community, in which Israel's national utility company, Makorot, tapped into and would extract water and distribute into other places under their control in the West Bank. And when they did that, IDF came in, of course, and destroyed their wells, and they destroyed the piping irrigation that they were trying to use for their own agricultural purposes. That particular community now only exists at 25% of the level of population Area C, as some of you know, is an area which Israel was trying to hold on to, colonize in order to say that it's for defensive purposes, that they have to have that in order to defend Israel, and they try to move Palestinians out of this area and restrict them in terms of the water. Another place is Bardala. Sarah was there, Lori was there, and Bardala is a Palestinian community. And again, the water in that area is something that's underneath in the aquifer that these communities had access to before '67, and then slowly over time, the National Israeli Water Company, Mekorot, comes in and restricts the wells that they have. They do not allow any new wells to be built. And when the communities get frustrated and try to tap into the water, because the only water they have is water that can be trucked in at twice the cost that it cost even Israeli to truck the water in, when they try to access water that's right there in their community, a few kilometers north of Bardala is a Merkorot pumping station, which we had a picture of. And that pumping station is part of the groundwater pumping that goes on that these villages don't get the use of. There's also a picture of the empty canal, top left there, you see that. The top right one is a fuzzy picture of the pumping station, and on the bottom left is one of those Israeli pumps. Yeah, the bottom left is one of those Israeli pumps of the Merkorot. And this is how the community is deprived of its water. And Sarah, is this the demolition over here? The bottom right?
That's a Bedouin community dwelling that's been destroyed nearby. But in any case, the water, this is the empty water canal. Oh, yeah. So, thank you. This is an empty, I don't know if it can be cleared up.
No, it doesn't get
Oh, it doesn't get clear. Okay.
there.
All right, that's still clear. So this is the Mekorot water supply, and then they are the people who cut off and destroyed 400 meters of water pipe to Bardala. And so you see the empty water canals, and this is also part of the pumping station that used to pump water to Bardala. And so it's a way of controlling. It's another facet of settler colonialism and controlling the population.
Thank you. I'm going to give one other example. It's called Karfdan. It's in, it's like Galilee area. It's a middle. It's where there's an open plain. It's under that area. That area is understood to be part of the breadbasket of Israel. There's the photo that you would have seen if it was in the slideshow shows a vast amount of Israeli fields. They're all green, and just south of that is areas that are not so green. And in Karfdan village, in 2010.
Sorry.
In 2010, exactly that happened. The villager dug his well because he needed water for his crops, and he couldn't access that water. And when he dug his well, he was back at his house, but a fellow villager called him and said, IDF is coming with their bulldozer, and by the time he got to his well, it was destroyed by the IDF. And that same day, 4 other wells were destroyed by the IDF. So this isn't a single example. Now I've given you 3. And there are different times and different tactics which are used to not just take the water, which is resource extraction, but to make sure that Palestinians don't have ingress or egress from the place from which they traditionally got their water. So we need to understand water. Water is a strategy of war. It's low-intensity warfare, and it's a very deliberate strategy, if not the most important strategy of the IDF for colonization of Palestinian land. Without water, none of these settlements, the new ones after '67 in the West Bank, could exist. Those of you who've had the displeasure of seeing Palestinian communities next to developments in which the developments have pristine swimming pools and sprinklers going off, at the same time the Palestinians don't have enough water to grow their crops, and with drought then they have crop failure. This is a deliberate war strategy, and we need to call it what it is. It's a war strategy. If you deprive people from water in an arid land, then you have declared war on them, even though on a daily basis it's not that apparent. It does become apparent very clearly if you're a Palestinian and you engage in traditional agriculture. The same thing could be said for the treatment of Bedouin, and I'll make a little side explanation here. The Bedouin are nomadic, seasonally nomadic. Oftentimes they have agriculture in one season and then they move their herds of sheep or goats to other places where there has been rainfall. There are various Autumn groups, but one of those groups are Tana Autumn, and the Tana Autumn traditionally until the 30s when wells were dug were also two-season people. They would move from their winter community in the low hills and the mountains, and then they would go down into the valleys, because when the monsoon rains come here in the summertime, then you see that the water is flowing, and then they would grow crops. The Autumn are those who are the environmentalists and scientists for 2,000 years worked on corn, and they have the fastest growing corn in the world. So this tactic is something that also then applies to the Autumn, but we'll get to that. So the use of water regimes is important, and see if I can find the slide. So there are 5 basic ways in which this water regime is applied. You see this map there that looks like some very genius young child's drawing. Is actually the map of how Israel controls the water and who has access to what water. You look at the blue dotted line, that's groundwater boundary that Israel has drawn haphazardly. You can probably make out what should be the 67 green line, and you see where the water line goes. The 67 green line in the wall, as you can tell, if the wall is all around, let's say, the green line, and then you see where the water is, you realize how superfluous the wall is to the colonization of the Palestinians. I'm not saying it's not important. It is important, because every day it stops people from being mobile. But more important is where the water goes. The red line is Israeli National Water Carrier, and you can see that they tap the water boundaries, and they use this Mercoro water line. But what they don't show you is all of the entries into the left the low western watershed area, which comes off of the West Bank. The West Bank is higher and more mountainous, and that watershed is in the lower area. And that lower area is what we know of as the seam zone. And in the seam zone, you will see the jagged wall going one way onto the west side of the 67 green line, and then it'll go to the right side of the green line, and it goes to the left side, and then it goes to the right side, and then it goes to the left side. That's not a very efficient way to build a wall. The reason it's that way is because they can capture the water. They can capture the water when it extends into Israel. If they already have that water, they don't need to worry about it. But if they want to go further into the West Bank, then they just build more wall, and they keep the Palestinians away from that resource that's then behind the wall. So the wall was used actually to capture water, and it still is. So there are 5 ways in which these regimes are used: the physical land-based displacement of indigenous Palestinians in Autumn, settler and or state extraction of water, I mentioned those. The third one is settler and or state storage of water, where water is stored and how you secure it. Fourth one is the use of militias and or militarily enforced restriction of indigenous families from point sources of water, like those 3 examples I mentioned, for those who then try to get access anyway because they know that the water is just there in their community and all they need to do is tap into it. Then the militias, the paramilitaries are used to stop that. The 5th one is the paramilitary and military threats and attacks against indigenous Palestinians in Autumn who resist exclusive water extraction by the occupiers. Okay, I'm going to move on. I will address some of this when we get to the Autumn, because the Autumn case is a little bit maybe more difficult to understand because it's not so graphic. Okay, these are the slides I couldn't find, but I've gone through this. This is Kartan, which is the last one that I mentioned. Basically, that's a summary of it. This is Area C, the teal color area, which surrounds Area A and Area B, but basically this part that's close to the Jordan Valley is where a lot of this contention happens, but not just there. And okay, so now there's one more example, and this one is, let me see where we're at. This is the Bardala. Okay, so this was Bardala which is the Palestinian community that Sarah and Lori visited, there's a spring in Bardala, but they're not allowed to then tap further in and have a regular water source, just this little gurgling stream. And if you look at this point here, it's about 10 miles away. The crow flies are 12 miles on the road, is Berkaot, and that is an Israeli settlement, and that has glistening swimming pools going on, and both of those are basically using the same watershed that's coming off of the mountains that are a little bit higher just to the west of that blue highway line. These are the photos I talked about before, which you've already saw, which pertain to Bardala. Those are the swimming pools that are in that community, Berkaot, and there you can see, it's kind of hard to see this, but that's a sprinkler. Of course, you need to water your grass in the desert, right? Okay. I'm going to move forward. Okay, looking at the Ottoman situation, for those who are not familiar with this is part of what was the Ottoman traditional territory. The entire Ottoman traditional territory expands from what is now Phoenix, so the Salt River, down to southeast and southwestern Durango. There are Ottoman-speaking people in Durango. They're called Tepehuan, but you ask them what they speak, and they speak Ottoman. There are Ottoman in one part of Sinaloa. There's Ottoman in the mountains of Chihuahua. There's mountains in the Sierra Madre of the state of Sonora. There are lowland Ottoman in parts of Sonora, and in northern Sonora are where you now see this map. But historically, that's the entire reach of the Ottoman, an arc of 1,200 miles. I need to mention a couple of things because there's a history that's not known about Ottoman. The missions of Ottoman were largely in the valleys where River Ottoman lived, called Akimel Ottoman, and that went on for a couple hundred years. That was the contact with Spanish colonizers. Many of you are familiar with that. It's similar to other parts of Latin America, except this was the furthest northern border of New Spain. Mexican or Spanish troops could never hold this area. It was a contested area, and the Ottoman oftentimes were in alliance and or opposed to the Spanish military, depending on what they were doing. The River Ottoman, like other people, were victims of the plague brought in by the Spaniards, and the death rate for Ottoman in southern Sonora was 62%. Akimel Ottoman. In the north, which is basically Magdalena, Dolores, Sonora, up through the missions in this area, the death rate was 65%. But the Tana Ottoman didn't live in the river areas. They lived in the far outside desert. So their population, which was half of that of what Akimel Ottoman were, then became, after those facts and into the 1800s, slowly gained and became the majority population, whereas previously it was Akimel Ottoman. They're all Ottoman. There's not some ethnic divide there. This is just a distinction of different types of land use, as Jose has often reminded me. The tribe on this side got legal recognition in 1917. The Tana Ottoman Nation became a tribe by executive order, and by executive order they can be undone. Two-thirds of the border, two-thirds of the Ottoman were separated from one-third of the Ottoman because of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, 1848 and 1852. The border was moved from the Gila River down to Nogales, and that's what caused that legal separation. None of the Ottoman groups were consulted by the Mexican government nor the American government when that happened. So that basically left what are now somewhere between 2,500 and 3,200 Ottoman in northern Sonora. In terms of further things that were acts of direct settler colonization, it's a bit difficult to get through all of it because we're talking about the history of two countries and then the history of the nation of the Ottoman, but I'm going to hit some highlights. One is that in Sonora, at the national level and at the state level, there were colonization commissions which were put into place by the Calles administration in the late 1940s. In 1950, titles were given to local ranchers in the Altar Valley and the Sonoita Valley and in the area around Caborca. And these were areas where Ottoman had for a very long time lived and grew crops, both Akimel Ottoman and Tana Ottoman. A dam was built into Butama in Altar Valley, just north of Altar, for those of you who've been to Altar, and then the water in that watershed, which comes off of the western mountains of Nogales, was all collected and put in canals, and that water was distributed to those who were given titles, which were the ranchers who had elite political connections to the state government. Autumn title or autumn customary use was completely ignored and has been ignored until today. On the U.S. side, the United States created a reservation which was added and subtracted to for about 25 or 30 years. It's the current one that's west of Tucson, including some bits and pieces between Tucson and Phoenix. There's not enough time to describe them. But other lands of the Autumn were designated as national lands, the same kind of tactics or strategy that Israel has used in terms of its forests to depopulate areas that they wanted to move Palestinians out in the post-Nakba period. That includes a national park, SOAW National Park in 1933, Ironwood National Monument made in 1937, the Cabeza Prieta Wildlife Refuge made in 1939, the Berry Goldwater Bombing Range in 1941, and two major cities, one called Phoenix and the other one called Tucson. All this legislation completely ignored both the Autumn, Tana Autumn, the Akimel Autumn, and then those who are the most nomadic, the Hiachet Autumn, who lived in the far west desert where there's less than 3 inches of rainfall per year. In reaction to these moves and to the colonization of those valleys, because the Mexican government brought in colonizers from Mexicali, mestizos from other areas, often had to flee. People who live in Gouveau district, which is now on the U.S. side of the Autumn territory, often went in the summertime and attended fields in what is called Sanoita or an Autumn Shonoidik. And by the 1950s, they no longer could do that, and they were run out of their own fields and have a very deep resentment of what happened in Mexico, even today, because of that. There are other Autumn communities who visited seasonally, those Autumn who are from around Ajo, perhaps some of Nelly Joe's relatives. Others, as far as Zacaton, Arizona, all of this was happening in 1947, 1948. What this did, the colonization, which was the second wave of settler colonization of the Autumn, the first one was the church. The second wave, what it did was it permanently damaged the relationship, the interchange of labor and trade of goods between those Autumn who lived in the river area and the Tana Autumn who lived in the desert. Because the people who lived in the river areas depended traditionally on the extra labor of those who from the desert, because they would come at harvest time in August to help them with their crops. And the people who are Tana Autumn who would come from the desert would bring their goods, their baskets, the food they made from the desert, and they would trade with those Akimel Autumn. The Spaniards tried to stop this exchange of goods between Autumn groups, and this was a second blow to that because it meant that they didn't have access to the growing areas in the river valleys, and then many of them were urbanized or dispersed and moved on to other areas. What I'm going to do now is trying to find these slides, the Autumn slides. No. Keep going, maybe it's in front of, maybe keep going, maybe it's in front of them. All right. I don't know. I'll just keep talking. So I'm going to try to walk you through the issue of understanding how settler colonialism works in this border and then in Israel. I mentioned before the formation of paramilitaries and militias in the pre-1948 period, which led to a military. And it's important to understand that now in terms of the Autumn context, because we have had in the Autumn Desert or the Sonoran Desert for a long time the presence of sort of low-level smuggling operations. Smuggling is as old as deserts. But the height and the amount of armaments that have gone with that smuggling in the last 20 years has become something disproportional to the Autumn and disproportional to the desert itself. So what I'm talking about is the confluence of immigrant smuggling operations and drug smuggling operations. Prior to about 10 years ago, those two things were very separate. They weren't the same thing. People would immigrate here, they used a smuggler, they didn't use a smuggler, they would go through the desert with somebody or they didn't go with somebody. And that was very normal. But in the last 10 years, the Sinaloa cartel, which is the largest cartel in all of the Americas, it outpaces all of the other cartels by a scale of 7 to 1, is the cartel that is in charge of this border area and distributes drugs into the United States. And if we had a slide, you would see that they have a presence in 28 states of the United States, 6 to 7 times larger than all the other cartels. So when you read headlines about cartels, quote unquote cartels, there's a difference. There's a difference between a multinational, multi-billion enterprise and a small cartel, Templares in Oaxaca, who will be around for 5 years and then they'll be snuffed out. The DEA has had a strategy for 35 years saying what we have to do is cut off the head of the snake and then the snake disappears. Well, it appears that the snake doesn't just disappear, it just keeps regenerating. But there's one cartel that is never done away with. That cartel was caught laundering $287 billion. It's in a Guardian article. You can read about it. That's $28.7 billion per year. That's double the amount of money that the Border Patrol has in the border area in which you are now. So who's guarding who? The former Inspector General of the Department of Homeland Security, Mr. Tomczyk, who was removed from his job, was investigating all of the murders on the border, the 20-plus murders of people by the Border Patrol. And as part of that, he was looking at the corruption levels within the Border Patrol, and he had friends in the FBI, and he himself was a former 20-year veteran of the Secret Service before they tried to discredit him in a Senate hearing, which didn't work because he brought some of his FBI buddies with him. And he said between 5 and 10% of the Border Patrol agents and officers are actively corrupt or at some point in their careers have been corrupted by the cartel. We have 22,000 Border Patrolmen. If you do the math, that's between 1,100 and 2,200 Border Patrolmen who are under corruption, according to the former Inspector General of the Department of Homeland Security, Tomczyk. So if you doubt what I'm now going to say, then you can read the studies and see that what I'm saying is documented. There's a small slide here which you can't see, and it shows 19 little dots of some cases that were investigated, over 200 cases investigated by the Center for Investigative Journalism, which showed that there was over, in a 2-year period, some 200 and some cases along the whole border patrol corruption. In this sector, the Tucson sector, which goes from Douglas all the way to Yuma, there were 19 cases of corruption. 2 weeks ago, a colleague, Jeff Boyce, sent me an article talking about a border patrolman, quote unquote, who was caught doing the following. He was taking $300,000 and delivering to someone at the San Miguel gate to give back to the cartel. He was importing cocaine at the same time. He previously had been known to have exported arms, and he had ordered a hit on his ex-girlfriend to get rid of her. And my analysis would be is that wasn't just your normal border patrolman. That's probably a cartel operative who's been down the border patrol for some time. For that person to be in charge of all of those things at the same time, it's either a frame-up or something is going on in the business model. Why am I bringing all this up? Because if we're going to understand what happens in the border, there's also this death map, which if you could see this, you would understand there's a bunch of red dots there. All of those red dots are in the Tanatam Nation. It has the single largest number of concentrated deaths in the United States of anywhere. Those are immigrant deaths. And as the architecture was explained by Gabe of the surveillance and all of that, it was designed, the new border, to push people into that area and for them to die their death or to be caught by the Border Patrol. But what doesn't happen is it doesn't stop the narcotics. Why is that? And that's the business model that matters to this enterprise. This is why they corrupt officials. This is why they can distribute drugs through 28 states in the United States. Because there is really no difference at this point between the operations of a cartel that has bought off that many people and the cartel itself. That's the paramilitary occupation of Tanatam territory. What they do is use areas close to the border for staging. These are ranches who were owned by the same ranchers who in the 1940s were given title by the Mexican government. They have carte blanche to move their goods in and out and across the border. They've already invaded 2 Atum communities, taken them over, and they run their operations. This is, however, a sideshow as to what really happens. What really happens is the following. Here we're at the port of entry Nogales, where 90%, 80 to 90%, according to the CBP, all of the cartel's drugs comes through, and they come through on trailers. And they come through on trailers because we have an expanded port, Those of you who've been through the Mariposa crossing know that it's an expanded port. Why? Because more trucks are allowed to come through. So why do we have these expanded ports? Because there was post 9/11 Homeland Security money to improve the border security, quote unquote border security. Border security was mostly spent on ports of entry to make the ports of entry bigger, plus we added money for the Border Patrol stations. But there's been an unbelievable increase in the volume of goods that come in because of free trade. It's called NAFTA or whatever they call it now, and because of CAFTA. And that exponential increase in free trade and traded goods has also shown a parallel increase in the amount of narcotics brought through into this country. 90%. It's only 10% that we're talking about in the rural areas where we need to have the wall, quote unquote, according to our new commander-in-chief, and so on and so forth. That's the area that the industry wants to pump up because that's where they can make money. So what does this have to do with settler colonialism? Before states can sanction this kind of an arrangement, you have to have paramilitaries. Because paramilitaries can get away with what states cannot get away with. And paramilitaries usually start out as being ideologically driven, like the Irgun and like the Palmar in Palestine. In the end, we will see more hardware come and more militarization of the border, but what we know is that all of that militarization, that hardware, and that technology depends on having people in these areas that can occupy this land and they can make sure that they hold on to the water. In the case of the water, there were slides that we would have shown that shows Washan, a pond, Jose's families, a well that is there in places in Pozo Verde, which is 12 miles away, which was the winter village of the summer village, and those places have been used by cartel for transshipments. So the towers in a slide you may see delineates where El Bit is now trying to place all of its towers, but given the business model that I explained to you, I think it's highly doubtful that that's going to be used to stop narcotics. It's going to be used to stop people, principally immigrants, and principally to block the Autumn from coming into their own territory. The one thing that I didn't explain is that 2,500 members of the Tana Autumn Nation live in Sonora. They're card-carrying members of the Tana Autumn Nation. They have legal rights like all the other members of the 562 federally recognized tribes in the United States. But their indigenous rights are being denied on a daily basis because they are not allowed to cross through unless they have a Mexican passport and a U.S. visa. There were 3 traditional points of entry. Those 3 points of entry have been closed down. One of them has a button, I'm not kidding you, a button which supposedly if you're an Autumn you can go up and push the button, and then supposedly a border patrolman appears. And someone did this in duress when they were fleeing a cartel, and no one appeared, but they walked in for a half a mile and found the border patrolman asleep in his car. That's our high technology at work. So to wrap this up, decolonization, others may want to add into this. It's easy to feel overwhelmed by the scale of border militarization and the technology that's employed by El Bit, by Boeing, and many other companies. However, I think we have to take the long view. The Autumn at San Javier, next to the Santa Cruz River in Tucson, noticed that in the 1970s their water was all being depleted by the city of Tucson, which never asked their permission, and that's why that river ran dry. They went to federal court, the cooperative of farmers, because one woman saw that she no longer could grow crops. And she started the suit, and the other Autumn joined her. And after 20 years in federal court, when they sued the city of Tucson, and the state also backed up the city of Tucson, and they were told they would never get that water back, they won their suit. And if you look on Google Earth and you look at San Javier, you'll see that it's the only green area that is in the vicinity of Tucson to that extent. Why? Because they then reused their tradition. They came back, they started growing their crops more on a commercial basis, but turning that place, which had been dried up for all of that time, and went back to their practices of agriculture and took this stand against the city, which was carved out of their former homeland. This is just one example of litigation. In the United States, we have the luxury of talking about litigation, but on the flip side, in Palestine, it is the same struggle in terms of looking for how to get access back to water in order to hold on to the communities that are there, and how to access water that has been restricted, because water is a war strategy. So a decolonization strategy has to look at that and understand that that is part of what Israel is trying to do. In this desert, the cartel can't exist in these ranches without water. They can't transport. No one can live in this area. The Border Patrol cannot live, and they can't occupy the Tanatam Nation without the water. So I'm not saying this is just a symbolic gesture, but the strategies that we might want to consider are those that look at water regimes and how they're used for settler colonization. So that's it.
Thank you. We only have about 10-15 minutes for your questions and answers. Before we do that, we actually had a 10-minute video that we wanted to show you, but you can Google it and find. It's called The Danger of Neutrality. When it comes to Israel-Palestine, okay, often we hear people, they say, this is a divisive issue, we don't want to take sides, we're neutral, okay? If you are a progressive person, if you care about justice, you can't be neutral.
Right.
You have to make up your mind. So, Google The Danger of Neutrality. It's by Anna Bolzer. It's a TED Talk kind of thing. TED presentation. Okay, it's just 10 minutes, but it's worth it. The other thing that I wanted to point out is that at this time, Palestine Solidarity in this country is under attack. And under attack in the name of fighting anti-Semitism. Okay. After Pittsburgh, the charge of anti-Semitism has been abused so much, okay, that it is really getting to be very, very dangerous. The attacks on Students for Justice in Palestine, the attacks on the BDS movement, they're trying to criminalize free speech on this issue. They're not saying anything, we are, I posted yesterday on Facebook, as people of conscience, we must strongly reject and resist and fight anti-Semitism. But at the same time, we must resist and reject the abuse of this charge, okay, to attack those who criticize Israel. So we want your help with that and be open-minded about this issue. So please do so. And so if you have any questions, Tasneem here is going to coordinate these questions that you have.
Just one more thing that Blake has to mention about an upcoming workshop.
The Autumn presence here will be moving to a workshop at 2:30 on the defense of the sacred salt sites in Alto Golfo. If you want to look at Autumn resistance as an example of what we're talking about, please come to that. 2:30.
Thank you.
Or 2:20.
Where is that being held?
Tent number 1.
Thank you.
Question in the back there.
Here comes the mic.
We need a
We need to have you speak into the mic. Thank you.
Yo vengo del área de la Bahía de San Francisco. I come from the San Francisco Bay Area, where many of these flotillas have started. People like Henry Knorr. Personas como Henry Knorr, o sea, nosotros hemos empezado estos viajes a Palestina. We have weekly vigils. We have events with Muslims. We just elected our first Muslim girl. She's a very young woman. To the Hayward, but we also have threats constantly that we are being anti-Semitic. O sea, acabamos de elegir a nuestra primera musulmana al condado y hemos elegido a dos musulmanas. O sea, and we also elected, two Muslims. But the point is that constantly we are being threatened. People are starting to approach us. We have a vigil and then we have events. Like we had Mecca, the Middle Eastern Children's Alliance.
One of the best organizations.
Huh?
One of the best organizations there is.
I sang, but that has nothing to do with it. The point is, in my country, which is Cuba, we still have Guantanamo, where people have been tortured, trained in this goddamn School of the Americas. And so I always say, close the goddamn place. The people that have done that have been trained first in Israel. They used to offer before, as you said, before 1948, they were offering, come and have a nice trip to our beautiful country. And what they do is what I call othering. Lo que hacen es tratar a la gente como que son cochinos, como los indígenas. I went to Standing Rock twice, and the level of violence against the indigenous people in Standing Rock, we were being poisoned. I came back so sick, it's not funny.
Did you have a question? We only have a few more minutes.
The point is that the difficult is, we probably are going to, we've been told that we might be charged with a hate crime for the vigils and the acts that we had. Now, I'm sorry, Middle Eastern Children's Alliance had a fund. We did a thing, and all the children were asked, what do you want? And people, they thought, they're gonna want, I don't know, Legos or whatever, or an iPhone. And what they said is, we want water to drink that is clean.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the detail of history that was presented. And I'm wondering, since you all were talking about the clear connections that exist between the corporations, the companies that are militarizing borders, both in Palestine and here, I'm wondering if you see a larger connection between or with the economic system worldwide, because there are also other walls in other places between India and Bangladesh, being one of them. And so I'm wondering if you could talk about that.
I want to front Todd's new book coming out in several months called Empire of Borders. And he does his own research as well as cite many scholars, one of whom, for example, pointed out that border walls have tripled since 1988. There were just a handful, and counted them all up, and there are dozens and dozens all over the world. And he essentially looks at the analysis of his first book, Border Patrol Nation, and just doing essentially a sequel and looking at the internationalization of borders, specifically U.S., but also, yes, these other world powers, many of them settler colonists. And Todd's the man on this issue.
I would make another connection. We will have, and we have had, and we will continue to have an exodus from Central America. We had an exodus from Mexico. Those are directly related to the free trade agreements. 6 million people directly lost their jobs in Mexico. Since up to 2013, 0.6 million in Guatemala alone. That's 6.6 million. If you bring one relative with you, that's over the 12 million undocumented in this country. We had a collapse in 2008 in this country of the economic system, of the biggest country in the world. I think it was Pee Wee Herman who said, connect the dots. Yes, neoliberalism is what we all know, but it's also failing. And so we have to take that understanding very clearly. We have myopia because we're Americans.
Yeah.
We have to look at the economic system and see what's going on, and we see that it is a structural failure. And as the structural failure mounts, so will the repression. If you're from Latin America and you've lived in another country, if you're from the Middle East or you're from other places where this has happened, you see the cycle, you see the military governments, authoritarian governments coming in. We have to connect the dots on the economic level. Just like we tried to connect the dots here, we have to try to understand that in the larger picture.
Let's give the mic.
There's a question back.
Let's give the mic to Mike.
The mic to Mike. Okay, excuse me.
While you're getting there, I want somebody, our friend there, mentioned that is training of police and law enforcement in Israel. You need to go to Jewish Voice for Peace. It's an organization that now it has a campaign called Deadly Exchange. It exposes what's happening, including what the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League that you hear about, and it has always this glow around it, what they do. I'm sure they practice, defamation against Palestine Solidarity, but also they facilitate a training of ICE personnel in Israel. So you need to be aware of that, and then go to Jewish Voice for Peace and look up Deadly Exchange.
Something that was not mentioned as far as the occupation of all of the land. One, I agree that the United States Border Patrol, which for the last 15 years I've been calling an occupying army on all of the land. But the other thing is you need to understand that the colonialosm tribal governments, and I say that in the plural, the central government and the 11 district governments, they are all complicit with Homeland Security in the oppression of undocumented migrants, mass migrant deaths on the Thornhill of the nation, where 50% of migrant deaths are taking place on the nation, and the Social Justice Committee in Southern Arizona is absolutely silent. So the Thornhill of the nation is complicit in the oppression of its own people. We who were once the oppressor, we who were once the oppressed are now the oppressors. So my point is, if we collectively are going to hold the Israeli government morally, politically, and militarily accountable, you must hold the colonialist tribal governments morally, politically accountable for migrant deaths and oppression against them and also against their own people. As was said earlier, silence is not a safe, feel-good, neutral position. Your silence perpetuates oppression, whether in Palestine or on all of the nations on both sides of the international border. But don't get me started.
Thank you. Thank you. Any other questions? Anyone else have a quick question? Maybe we can take one more.
It's just a logistical question, so I can shout it.
Shout it out, yeah. Maybe you shout it out.
Is this presentation that you made today available on your website?
It is available.
Please use mic. Thank you.
It is video streamed on our Facebook page. Okay. Right now it's been video streamed, but it's also recorded as well, so you can go back to it on our Arizona Palestine Solidarity Alliance Facebook page at Arizona Palestine. That's what it is.
Thank you. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.